Welcome to this E+3 lecture to be delivered by Eveline Fedorenko. My name is Ping Li. I'm actually running this from Hong Kong, which is nighttime here. So I have to say good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. So we are very pleased today to have the opportunity to listen to some wonderful ideas about the language system in the brain by Dr. Fedorenko. I wanted to give a little bit of background of this lecture series. We just got started toward the end of last year. And the first lecture was delivered by Brian McQueenie, which is right here. And Brian, Arturo Hernandez, Kathy Harris, the four of us started to talk about what we can do as a group in the field to help with, getting some lectures organized and share ideas. No matter where you are. So this is the remnants of, I think, a pandemic in some way, because we are now so much used to running lectures, talks through Zoom. So I'm really pleased that we actually now can do this. As you can see, in just a couple of minutes, we got to 150 people, I think from all over the world, wanting to listen to Dr. Fedorenko. So very pleased to have this opportunity. Before I give an instruction to Ed, so I wanted to ask Brian, Kathy, and Arturo, do you guys want to say a few words, please, about this lecture series? Kathy, I can see you. I don't see Arturo or Brian. You want to say anything?
A few words.
I'm here too.
Oh, okay.
Well, Catherine.
Go ahead. Howdy. The lecture series is to celebrate Elizabeth Bates, and she has so much to offer. We also want to help people have a historical perspective and situate current science in the framework of discoveries of the last decades. I'll let the next Arturo go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I guess, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I guess good day to everyone. I want to say good morning, but it's just morning for me, and I know it's not morning for everybody. I mean, I think just to echo Catherine's and Ping's sentiments. It's interesting to think about where we are now and all of the tools that are available, like, as we'll see today, and then where people were, decades ago, and sort of how those two things fit together. I think it's really exciting to have this series.
Brian, please.
Yeah, I'm just suddenly zooming back to 1974 when I first met Liz, and she had already figured everything out. Her emergentist concepts and everything. Of course, now we have to fill in the details. So it's great to have this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you all. So I wanted to mention we have a Q&A session toward the end, and this lecture series is really meant to engage, crosstalk, and discussion, brainstorming. So we really treasure our scholarly exchange of ideas, no matter what perspectives you have. And if you have a question toward the end, probably best if you can hold your questions toward the end. But if you have a burning question, feel free to interrupt. And then I would still, I think all of us prefer to speak up. Turn on your camera, please, if you can. We just had a study that was published 3 weeks ago saying turning on the cameras, showing the face of the teacher is very helpful. So please do turn on your camera if you can, and talk directly to colleagues on Zoom, especially to, of course, our speaker, Dr. Fedorenko. So let me very quickly give a introduction to Dr. Fedorenko. I think she doesn't really need a lot of introduction. Currently, Dr. Fedorenko is the associate professor in the Department of Brain and the Cognitive Sciences, as well as an investigator in the McGovern Institute for Brain Research. Dr. Fedorenko's work seeks to understand the cognitive and the neural mechanisms underlying language. She has, through her work, implicated specific brain regions together comprising what she calls the language network in linguistic processing. She uses a range of approaches, including behavioral analysis, brain imaging, including fMRI, ERP, MEG, genotyping, intracranial recording in patients, and the study of neurodevelopmental disorders. By using these different methods, Dr. Fedorenko is building a picture of the computations and the representations that underlie language processing in the human brain. Today, you will hear a variety of topics or a variety of methods, probably mostly using functional MRI to address these issues. She's engaged in a number of projects. I do want to mention two which might be highly relevant to her talk today. One is using state-of-the-art decoding and deep neural nets to develop a precise model describing the language regions. And the other one is to probe the cognitive and the neural architecture of individuals with exceptional linguistic talents, the so-called hyperpolyglots. Some of you may have already read her article published a couple of months ago in Cerebral Cortex. And her team has been extremely productive just in the past, I believe, 6 weeks. We saw a Nature Human Behavior article, and most recently, Nature Reviews Neuroscience review article. I suspect, I haven't really checked with her, I suspect much of her talk can be found in this latest Nature Reviews Neuroscience article. That is to say, if you missed something from her talk today, feel free to go back to this brand new NRN paper. So with that, let me stop here and turn the podium to Dr. Fedorenko. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bing. And thanks so much for having me. It's a really a huge honor to speak in this talk series. So I'll start by saying that I've been a fan of Liz's work for many years, and her work has influenced my own thinking in deep fundamental ways. In 2001, when I was applying to PhD programs, I applied to Liz's group as well. And it was the only place I didn't get accepted to. And I later heard from some of her colleagues that she was quite amused that I would apply to work with her, coming in from recommendation letters from Alfonso Karamazza, who was my undergraduate advisor, and Ted Gibson, who I took classes with as an undergrad. Of course, by then, who of course, for those of you who may not have that background, at some point thought quite differently about language from how Liz did. Of course, by that point, Gibson had turned from Chomsky and syntax-centric approaches to functional ones. But in any case, I have been reading Liz's work for over 20 years, and I'm really sad I never got to meet her in person because I think we would have gotten along. And apologies in advance if I have to like cough or have a sip of tea because I'm just a little recovering from a cold. Okay. So I'm really excited to share with you the work my group has done over the last 15 years or so. Today, I'm going to focus on 3 big lines of work. First, I'm going to talk about how language relates to various other capacities. Next, I'm going to zoom into the language system and discuss its internal structure. And finally, I'm going to talk about our recent, kind of the latest, most recent line of work where we try to relate neural network language models like GPT-2 to human neural responses to language. So use these models as models of human language processing. Before I do that, I'm going to say a few words about the methodological foundation of this research enterprise. And then I'll give a brief introduction to this system, the language system that I'll focus on today. So when I started working on the language system using neural methods, which was around 2006, I wanted to make sure that I could refer to the same functional areas across different individuals and across studies. there were many questions I wanted to ask about the system, and I wanted to be confident that across experiments, I'm studying the same brain regions. Of course, my vision was that eventually we can adopt the same way of defining these language areas across labs for a true collaborative research enterprise. So as a result, I took inspiration from kind of fields that are a little further ahead than language, like vision, and I began by developing a localizer paradigm that could be used to find language areas quickly and reliably. I used a contrast between people reading or listening to sentences and a control condition that is perceptually similar, but lacks linguistic meaning and structure, like a sequence of non-words or speech played backwards. And of course, a few regions in the left hemisphere respond strongly to this contrast. This is not surprising. We've known about the existence of such regions for quite some time. Here, the language systems of 5 individuals. Importantly, as you can see, the general topography is similar, but the precise locations, shapes, and sizes of these regions vary quite a bit. Although importantly, this topography is highly stable within a given individual over time. So here I'm showing you maps from 2 participants across 3 time points each. And I hope you can appreciate the similarity of the activation maps across the time points, so in each row. Because of this topographic variability across participants, the differences in the precise locations of these language areas, I have been arguing for a bunch of years that identifying these regions at the individual level is critical for drawing meaningful inferences about the system. A couple more quick things on methods. So first, although much of the work I'll talk about has been done on English, we have developed and released language localizers for many diverse languages in an effort to increase the both the generalizability of kind of critical findings about language and inclusivity in language research. So I'm showing you just some examples from native speakers of 6 languages. And I should say that at this point, I think Liz also cared deeply about including showing that certain findings from, for example, aphasia research don't readily generalize from languages like English to some other languages. And second, because individual functional localization is not always possible, like, for example, if you're working with dead brains and doing cellular analyses, we've created a probabilistic language atlas based on a little over 800 individuals we've scanned on the language localizer paradigm over the last decade or so. And this atlas can effectively be used to estimate for any given location in a template space, like the MNI space or the free surfer coordinate system, the probability that it falls within the language system. So we're trying to create kind of a universal frame of reference for this language system. So let me say a few words about some key properties of this system. These areas respond both when we understand language, spoken, written, or signed, as well as when we produce language, also across modalities. Together, these 2 properties suggest that the system is likely a place where we store our linguistic knowledge, our knowledge of what words mean and how to put them together. And using this knowledge, we can both encode thoughts into word sequences and decode others' thoughts from their utterances. These properties also show that this language system is distinct from lower level speech perception and articulation systems. So the classic Broca's and Wernicke's areas, as originally discovered, not the monstrosities they have become over the years in the literature, are actually not a part of this system. Broca's area is a lower level speech motor planning area. And this area receives input from this language system during language production. And Wernicke's area is likely a lower level speech perceptual area that extracts word sequences from speech and provides input to this higher level language system during comprehension. And the Nature Reviews Neuroscience paper that Ping mentioned discusses these issues in more detail. The regions of this network form, excuse me, a functionally integrated system with a high degree of synchronized activity. In fact, you can actually find this network without using localizer tasks. You can simply rely on patterns of bold signal fluctuations during naturalistic cognition paradigms like resting state, except you need a lot more than 3 minutes, which is what I need to do it with a functional contrast. You need about 40 minutes to an hour of resting state data to define the system reliably in individuals. But let me illustrate this using some of Rod Braga's work. So I'm showing you 3 sample subjects' brains. And for each brains, there's 2 kinds of data. So I'm going to zoom in on one brain just to make it easier to see. In black are the outlines of this network as defined from intrinsic bold signal fluctuation, so no test contrast whatsoever, just patterns of clustering of time courses of individual voxels, and overlaid in yellow and orange are the activations for the language localizer contrast. And there's an amazingly tight correspondence. And if we examine time courses of the 5 critical regions in the system, while participants listen to some language stimulus like a story, the correlations are in the 0.6 to 0.7 range. So this all suggests that this network is a meaningful and functionally coherent subset of the brain, distinct from internally integrated, and distinct from the rest of the brain. The language system responds to language in different test contexts, be it passive comprehension, making some judgments about sentences, or reading and answering comprehension questions. Basically, whenever interpretable linguistic input is present or is being generated, the system is engaged. And the system is also similar across diverse languages in its topography and properties. I already showed you briefly language maps and native speakers of different languages, and it also holds within bilingual or multilingual speakers for their different languages. So here are maps from 4 multilingual individuals. For each individual, here a column. I'm showing you maps of 2 of their languages, and hopefully, again, you can appreciate the similarity of the topographies between the top and the bottom image in each column. You may notice that one of those languages is not even a natural language, it's Klingon. That's a paper, should be coming out soon. Turns out it doesn't need to be a language that has been shaped over centuries by patterns of use. It could be an artificially constructed language, even for esoteric purposes, like creating an identity for a fictional species. As long as it has some of the same properties that natural languages, it engages the system in the same way. Finally, of course, we've long known that damage to these regions in adulthood leads to linguistic deficits. So these regions are critical to language function. Okay, so now let me talk about the first line of work on the relationship between language and other capacities. So many animals, including humans, do 3 kinds of things in the world, roughly. We perceive the environment through our senses. We acquire knowledge of the world and use this knowledge to reason and make predictions. And we physically interact with the world and with our conspecifics. So where does language fall in this tripartite structure? So the relationship between language and each of these 3 sets of abilities has actually been debated over the years. But most controversial, of course, has been the relationship between language and cognition, or language and thought. This relationship is actually what drew me to neuroscience. I started out as a behavioral cognitive scientist, but some of the questions I wanted to ask, cognitive science and behavioral experimentation doesn't provide direct tools for addressing. So for centuries, philosophers, linguists, evolutionary biologists, anthropologists have pondered these big questions like, are language and thought supported by the same machinery? Is thought possible without language? Why did language emerge in our species? Did language make us smart? And even without empirical data, in some cases in spite of it, many have offered strong opinions on these questions. Quite a few have argued that language and thought share machinery, and that thought is actually not possible without language. I'll give you a sample quote from one philosopher, Noam Chomsky, on this first question, when he writes, the systems of thought use linguistic expressions for reasoning, interpretation, organizing action, and other mental acts. And here's what he thought about the second question. A substantial part of what we call thinking is simply linguistic manipulation. So if there is a severe deficit of language, there will be a severe deficit of thought. He's not the only one who has placed language as the kind of centerpiece of complex thought. I'm just choosing quotes from him because he has a lot of colorful ones to pick from. But I'm going to argue that the evidence does not support these claims. Before I tell you about the evidence, let me say something about what we actually mean by thought. After all, it's a pretty broad construct. And in the broadest way, thought encompasses our knowledge of the world and reasoning over these knowledge representations, which includes making inferences and predictions. And we can talk about both general world knowledge, but also particular domains like knowledge of the physical properties of objects or knowledge of social agents. Reasoning can also be domain general, abstracted away from particular knowledge bases. This kind of reasoning is often linked to the notion of general fluid intelligence, and is associated with so-called executive abilities. In some human cultures, people also develop formal reasoning skills, including things like math and logic. So what is the relationship between our language system and these various cognitive abilities? So there's two primary tools that we have to answer this question, brain imaging tools and patient investigations. So I'm going to start with fMRI evidence. So over the years, we have tested for overlap between language processing and diverse perceptual, motor, and cognitive abilities. Here, I'm pulling data from over 30 experiments across a few hundred participants. This is all fMRI data for now. And in each experiment, it works the same way. So you find the language responsive areas in each individual brain, and then you ask, are these areas also active when we are looking at faces, when we're doing math, when we think about what somebody else is thinking? And in gray bars are responses to 3 language tasks: sentence listening, sentence reading, and sentence production. In this case, it's describing pictures of common events, plotted relative to a low-level baseline looking at a blank screen. So that's your 0 line. And in different colors, I'm showing you responses to various non-linguistic conditions. As you can see, language areas show strong selectivity for language over diverse inputs and tasks. These brain areas that work so hard when we process language work about as hard when you are solving a math problem or hold some information in working memory as they do when we're looking at a blank screen. And I should say that in this graph, we're averaging across these 5 core language areas. And the reason we're doing this is because the profiles are similar across them. So any given individual region looks the same. Critically, these areas don't show much response when we engage in thinking and reasoning tasks. I'm highlighting just a few domains here. And I should also mention that each of these 79 non-linguistic conditions elicits a very strong response in some other brain area or network. It's just that those areas seem to be distinct from the ones that process language. We're not done here yet. We keep trying to find domains or test additional domains where people have made claims about potential overlap with language. So I'm going to quickly show you data from 2 other reasoning tasks. These data are just being written up right now. It's fresh off the scanner, and Hope Keen is leading this effort. So the first task comes from work in Josh Tenenbaum's group, and it works something like this. So it's kind of trying to tap your inductive reasoning abilities, which is the basis of a lot of thinking we do in the world. So you see some input and the resulting output, and your task is to guess the rule that generated the output, right? So I'm trying to get you engaged in hypothesis generation. So you may have a few hypotheses, like, for example, maybe it's take the last element, or take the second element, or take the smallest number. So then you can test your hypothesis on some new input. And say that you go with your first hypothesis, take the last element, and you're told, no, that's wrong. The correct output is actually 2, 1. So then you try again. Maybe you try something like take the first 2 elements, and you're wrong again. So maybe then you have some kind of an aha moment, and you see that actually you have to remove element 7, and you try that, and that works. So this kind of inductive reasoning, as I said, is trying to find a hypothesis that best explains the data, is at the very core of both scientific reasoning and the kind of reasoning we engage in everyday life. So Hope measured people's brain responses when they engage in generating these hypotheses. And in a control condition, you're just told what the rule is and you have to apply it. So it's a simpler version of this task. Okay. The second task is a physical reasoning task, which was developed in Nancy Kammerscher's lab a few years ago. You see these kinds of unstable block towers, and you have to decide whether more blocks will fall on the red or on the green side of the table. And in the control condition, you decide whether there are more blue or more yellow blocks in the tower. So it's trying to elicit kind of physical judgments about stability in this case. So the gray bar here, again, is a response during a language task. And here are the responses during these 2 reasoning tasks, both of which robustly engage a different brain system. So once again, we see that the language system is silent while we think. A complementary approach for understanding the role of language in thought is to examine cognitive abilities in individuals who lack a properly functioning language system due to a condition like aphasia. And most informative here are cases of global aphasia, which result from severe damage to the language system, typically due to a large stroke. And this kind of damage leads to really profound deficits in both producing and understanding language. Rosemary Varley at UCL has done much of this work, including some studies in collaboration with us. And strikingly, she finds that in spite of these linguistic deficits, these individuals can think just fine. All of the cognitive abilities tested to date appear to be intact. And we're currently testing the program induction task I just introduced to you, and they seem to be able to do that one too. So the only thing these patients lack seems to be the ability to convert their thoughts into a verbal format and to extract meaningful information from others' linguistic productions. So to come back to our big questions, in this part, empirically, it turns out that language and thought draw on distinct resources in the brain. And even in the presence of severe language deficits, thinking and reasoning can remain intact. What about these other two questions? Why do we have language? Is it language that made us smart? Well, of course, we don't know, but I think one most plausible function of language is communication. And there's a lot of evidence now showing that many properties of natural languages appear to be optimized for efficient information transfer, from the sound systems to how the lexicon carves out the conceptual space, to how syntax works. And I think you have maybe Ted and Roger and Noga Zaslavsky coming up in this talk series, so you'll hear a lot more about these communicatively optimal properties of natural languages. What I've shown you, I think, is that it doesn't seem to be the case that language endowed us with some kind of new representational format or new algorithms. But what it did do, it certainly allowed for something like cross-generational transmission of acquired knowledge, building knowledge upon knowledge, which has transformed our species, allowing us to build the civilizations we have on our planet today. And with Ted and Steve Piantedosi, we have a piece that should be coming out soon on this issue. Okay, so so why do I even care about the selectivity for language, right? Why is that a big deal? Well, knowing what something is not can tell you a lot about what something is. So the selectivity of the language system rules out a whole number of hypotheses about what the system is doing. So, for example, given what I've told you, it's now clear that the language regions show a strong response to sentences, not because sentences have hierarchical structure, because other structured stimuli like music or mathematical expressions don't elicit a response in the system. It's not because sentences are meaningful, because event pictures and videos elicit a much lower response. It's not because sentences contain logical arguments, sometimes contain logical arguments or describe mental states, because non-linguistic stimuli with those properties don't elicit a response. And it's not even because sentences are communicative signals, because things like facial expressions or speech accompanying gestures, again, do not engage these regions. So the possibilities that remain seem to be restricted to something to do with specifically linguistic structure or meaning. So let's take a deeper dive inside the system. So what computations could the system support? When you read or hear a sentence, like a red-haired woman is playing with her dog on a beach near a lighthouse, there are a few things that you must do to figure out what the sentence means. You have to access the meanings of words from memory, like red-haired, woman, dog. I'm showing them with pictures, but presumably the meanings are more abstract. This is just a convenient shorthand. And you have to use your knowledge of the grammar to determine how words go together to make a complex meaning. So you have to figure out that red-haired modifies woman, and with goes with her dog, and so on. Once you put all the pieces together, you have some kind of a representation of the sentence meaning in your mind. How exactly we retrieve word meanings and how we build these compositional representations remains a matter of debate, but a number of paradigms have been developed to engage these operations, which allows us to look for sensitivity to these cognitive demands in the brain. For example, to text word retrieval, you can compare the processing of real words, where we have to access meanings from memory, and the processing of non-words, or sometimes called pseudo-words, which are similar to words, but don't map onto memory representations, like WUG. And to test text cognitive demands associated with constructing a sentence, we can compare sentences with lists of unconnected words. We can also try to isolate sentence structure building from complex meaning construction by using stimuli inspired by Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky poem, where all the nouns, verbs, and adjectives are replaced by non-words, but all the little words like articles and prepositions, as well as functional morphological markers, stay in place. So it may be something like a fen-byred Mullen is crowing with her wug. And comparing these stimuli to lists of non-words, we can try to isolate kind of more pure structure building, if you will. So how do our language regions respond to these different conditions? Here's a sample region in the posterior temporal lobe. And as you can see, sentences, the red bar, which tags both word retrieval and sentence construction, elicit a strong response. The response is stronger than the response to unconnected words, the pink bar, and a list of words in turn elicits a stronger response than a list of non-words, light orange bar. So it looks like this language area is sensitive to both word retrieval demands and sentence structure building demands. It is also sensitive to, is it also sensitive to structure building when we can't infer complex meanings easily, like in the cases of those Jabberwocky sentences? Indeed, the Jabberwocky condition, the dark orange bar, elicits a stronger response than a list of non-words. But this is just one language area. Do other language areas show any kind of different profile of response, perhaps with selective sensitivity to structure or word meaning processing? And here are two other areas, and they actually show a similar profile. And this profile basically holds across the whole language network, including when sampling at finer spatial and temporal resolution, like, for example, when using intracranial recording approaches. So for now, let's tentatively say that at least in terms of these broad distinctions, different language areas are functionally similar. They all support both word retrieval and sentence structure building. This strong integration between these two aspects of language, of course, makes a lot of sense given the highly contextualized nature of language processing, where interpreting individual words is highly dependent on the preceding words, and properties of particular words place strong constraints on which other words they can combine with. So it's really hard to think about word retrieval as independent from structure building. A point that I think Liz has made plenty often in her own work. So let's dig a little deeper into how we build sentence representations. So there are two broad theories, and you'll hear about both of them in your future talks. According to one story, we integrate incoming words into representations of earlier input in working memory, and difficulties arise when you have to connect a word to another word far back in the past. So let's go back to our example, which I changed just a little bit. A woman who is playing with her dog has red hair. When you get to has, you have to retrieve woman from memory to establish the connection between them. And at this point, it's been a while. You process 6 other words in between. So there is some cost to making this non-local dependencies. Ted Gibson was a strong proponent of this idea and kind of first articulated it in clear formal ways. An alternative story focuses on prediction and was developed most fully by Roger Levy. The key idea is that comprehension involves actively predicting likely upcoming elements. So at her, you may expect something like child or some other plausible pet like a dog. So if you get something like giraffe, you may be somewhat surprised. And there's a cost associated with processing this relatively unexpected element. I spent some time back in graduate school evaluating these different hypotheses using behavioral data, working with Ted and collaborating with Roger. And behaviorally, you basically find support for both integration and prediction. Neither account is sufficient on its own to explain patterns of processing difficulty as measured, for example, by reading times. So what about in the language system in the brain? So Corey Shannon and Dan Blank evaluated these theories with respect to neural responses in the language areas. And to do this, they adopted a naturalistic approach, which is becoming increasingly popular. So they simply had participants listen to some stories in the scanner. And in these stories, these two theories, the integration and the prediction theory, make a prediction at each word about the expected processing difficulty. I'm showing you just a couple of snippets. I'm sorry, it's kind of small, so it may be hard to see, to just visually illustrate that in many places, the two accounts make distinct predictions. So there is a correlation between these two accounts, but there are places where they come apart. And here's what we find in our neural measure. So I'm showing you, again, 3 sample language areas. And we find that similar to what has been found in behavioral work, both theories predict some independent various in neural responses, including after rigorous control for other factors that affect comprehension difficulty. Note that here the baseline is no longer fixation. The baseline here is the average response to a word across these stories. And these effects are extra costs that people experience due to these factors. So these results suggest that for sentence construction, we have evidence for both integration processes, where incoming words are connected to representations of earlier input and memory, and prediction processes where comprehenders form expectations about upcoming words and experience difficulty if those expectations are not fulfilled. And we see these effects in all language areas, but not in regions outside of this network. So it's not like you see this ubiquitously across the brain, which gives more credence to the no answer to this question about differences, functional differences among the language areas. Okay, so I've now shown you 2 kinds of effects related to language processing. One is a stronger response to structured stimuli like sentences compared to unstructured ones like lists of words. Another is a stronger response to input that is more difficult to process. In recent work, Grete Tuchkuta brought these 2 effects together in a single study. So she examined neural responses to 2,000 individual sentences sampled from a massive corpus of naturalistic text. And here I'm just showing you some examples. I put sentences in scare quotes because if you draw from naturally occurring spoken and written strings, you sometimes pull out quite messy examples. So this is by design. And she collected ratings of grammatical acceptability from an independent set of participants, which allowed us to look at the level of bold response as a function of sentence acceptability or some other ratings. In this case, I'm just focusing on this one. And what you find is a pretty clear nonlinear relationship. You can see it more clearly in the inset image, where responses are averaged in each of 6 acceptability bins. There are error bars there. They're just tiny because there are so many sentences in each bin. And we find that we kind of recapitulate these 2 kinds of effects I just told you about. So strings that are not well formed are similar to kind of our wordless conditions effectively. It's hard to make sense of those stimuli, and they elicit a relatively low response. Strings that are more well-formed elicit a stronger response, so we're capturing a continuum from less well-formed to more well-formed linguistic input. But strings that are really well-formed and very predictable and easy to process, again, elicit a lower response. So we're also capturing this continuum from easy to process to more difficult to process input. The study also sheds further light on the similarity of the functional profiles of the different language regions, because we can ask, how similar are the different regions' preferences across this massive number of particular sentences, right? If one language region likes a particular sentence, does another language region like that sentence, where like corresponds to something like a strong response? And indeed, they're very similar across region pairs. So this is a correlation for a posterior temporal and an inferior frontal region. And here's the full correlation matrix across the 5 language areas. And as you can see, these regions have similar preferences for different kinds of linguistic input. So at this point, I'm quite happy with a solid no answer to the question about the differences among the different components of the language system, at least given the data so far at the region level. But let's consider another dimension of potential differences among the language regions. We can ask, are there any language regions that are more critical for language function than others? And indeed, evidence from aphasia suggests that damage to the posterior temporal area is associated with more severe and longer lasting deficits. This is not a new finding. This has been observed by people like Lurie and Goodglass and others. But here's a quote from a modern day aphasiologist, Stephen Wilson, who, based on a recent investigation of recovery trajectories, wrote, not to imply that other brain regions play no role in sentence comprehension, but only the posterior temporoparietal region is truly indispensable. But if this area has a special status for language function, we should see this manifest in other ways. And we do. I'll show you briefly 2 strands of recent evidence. So first, remember how linguistic input that is more difficult to process elicits higher responses in the language areas. And this effect is present across the different language areas. But it turns out that really easy to process sentences actually only elicit a response in the posterior temporal area. So here's how responses look in this area. This is a parametric manipulation by sentence difficulty, with darker bars showing harder to process sentences. If we look in the inferior frontal area, we see the same general pattern. But pay attention to this data point. These easy sentences don't elicit a response above the fixation baseline. So you're not engaging this part of your language network to process, can we go for a walk, where they had other things to do. And this was one of the first times when I see a language area that's an intrinsic part of this interconnected system that's not engaged when people process language. And we're digging into this a lot more now. The second line of evidence comes from polyglots, a line of work that Ping mentioned in the introduction. So these are individuals who speak 5 or more languages, and it includes a subset of hyperpolyglots, individuals who speak 10 or more languages with varying levels of proficiency, of course. A little while ago, we reported that polyglots and hyperpolyglots have smaller language networks. So when they process their native language, the responses are weaker and less spatially extensive than in non-polyglots. More recently, we replicated this effect in a new group of polyglots, and looking into it more, discovered something interesting. Some polyglots don't show any reliable above baseline responses to native language in their inferior frontal areas. I'm highlighting this effect here for you in red. So for some polyglots, processing their native language is so effortless that it can be done focally within the temporal lobe. And I think this finding actually provides a potential mechanism for cases where following stroke, individuals have a better preservation of their non-native language, because non-native languages are processed in a more extensive way across the full set of areas. So complementing evidence from aphasia, the posterior language areas are always engaged when we process language and appear in some way to be sufficient to process language. So taking stock so far, the language system appears to support both word retrieval and sentence structure building during comprehension and production. This is true of all the different language regions, but the posterior temporal component appears to be necessary and sufficient for language. Finally, let's talk about large language models. So the question here is, could these models that I don't need to introduce anymore, they have taken the world by storm, could these models be useful to researchers who are trying to understand how language works in humans? And I think the answer is very much yes. After all, these are the first computational models that truly excel at language. And I no longer need to show demos to convince you how impressive these models are. I hope all of you have had a chance to interact with GPT style models like ChatGPT and to witness their incredible linguistic prowess. These models learn aspects of language that have long been argued to be impossible to learn from distributional information alone, settling decades-old debate about language learnability and whether language can be simply learned from using statistical learning mechanisms from the input. And how happy this would make Liz to see these recent findings. Moreover, these models are similar to the language system, human language system, in a few different ways. Both are sensitive to word meanings, but also to abstract syntactic rules. So even though in neural network models, you're not encoding anything, you're not hard coding any syntactic rules, there is sensitivity that emerges to abstract structures, has been shown across many, many studies. And similarly to the human brain, there doesn't appear to be any clear separation between the processing of linguistic structure and meaning. The very same units contribute to both. And of course, predictive processing is a core feature of large language models and plausibly the very foundation of their immense success. And evidence has been accumulating for human comprehension being predictive. So inspired by these similarities, we asked whether large language models, or LLMs, might also be similar to the language system in terms of the representations they build when they process linguistic input. To do this, the following approach can be used. And early versions of this kind of an approach were actually carried out by Tom Mitchell with Marcel Just, who I think I saw in the list of participants. It was a science paper in, I guess, 2008. So here you take a language stimulus, a sentence, and you feed it to a model, and you also present it to a human participant. From the model, you extract hidden unit activations from some layer, and from the brain responses from the language areas recorded with fMRI or some other approach. And then using these two sets of numbers, you compute some similarity metric. And there's a few different ways to do this, and generally findings are robust to which particular metric you use. So for example, you can build an encoding model based on a linear regression from unit activations to neural responses, and then test how well this model can predict human responses to new unseen language stimuli. So the values I'll be showing you are basically these cross-validated correlations. And I should clarify that by responses here, I mean the level of activity to different sentences in language responsive voxels or electrodes, if this is an intracranial recording study. And this approach is exactly what's been done in similar studies in other domains, like in studying the ventral visual stream or the human auditory areas. So using this basic approach, Martin Schrimpf led an effort to compare representations from over 40 language models against several human data sets. So each bar on this plot will be a model, and the majority are transformer architecture models. And similar models here are grouped by color. And on the y-axis, you see, I'll show you how well each model predicts human neural responses in the language system. So here's what we find. The gray ceiling line here is based on the internal reliability of the data set. So how well you can predict any given individual's responses from those of other human participants. And you can see that neural network models vary quite a lot in their performance, but some models in the class of unidirectional transformers do really well in capturing human neural responses. So the answer to our question appears to be yes, at least for some models. The representations of the linguistic input are similar to how humans represent linguistic inputs. And this result has now been replicated by a bunch of independent groups, including some work that Ping has done. So then we asked, why is it that some models are better than others? In vision, models that perform better on object recognition also provide a better match to primate visual responses. Language models are, of course, trained on word and context prediction. So is it the case that models that perform better on this task also provide a better fit to human neural data? And indeed, this relationship holds strongly. So next word prediction performance, shown here on the x-axis, robustly predicts brain likeness of the representations of these models. And individual models here are now dots. And I should say that this relationship appears to be quite selective. So you can look at how these models perform on other language tasks, like those, for those of you familiar, there's a standard NLP benchmark called GLUE. And performance on other kinds of tasks, even quite sophisticated ones like judging sentence meaning similarity or sentence grammaticality or something like that, is not predictive of the model's alignment, degree of alignment to human brains. So this selective relationship between performance on next word prediction and brain similarity suggests that optimizing for predictive representations may be a critical objective of both biological and in silico neural network models. Plausibly, this is, this is speculating now, but plausibly, this is because being able to accurately predict upcoming words effectively encourages a system to build a joint probability model of the linguistic input, which implicitly requires sensitivity to diverse kinds of regularities in the signal. We've been building on this work in various ways over the last couple of years. I'll mention just a couple of findings briefly. Perhaps the most common criticism of language models as models of human language processing is that they're not trained in developmentally plausible ways, both in terms of the amount and kind of data, but also the nature of the training process and so on. And that is absolutely right. So Iqbal Hosseini, this paper is actually out at the Neurobiology of Language, showed that you actually don't need massive amounts of training data to achieve relatively good model to brain alignment. So training on as little as 100 million tokens, which is on the order what kids are estimated to get during the first 10 years of life or so, already gets you quite good brain alignment. And Qingzhu Zhuang, who is now a postdoc in the lab, is training models not just on less data, but also on data that much more closely resemble the input that human children get, including combining linguistic inputs with visual inputs, and to see if models thus trained would better align with human responses to language, including in pediatric populations. Greta Tuchkuta, who I already mentioned before, showed that language models represent linguistic input similarly enough to humans to actually enable what's called the non-invasive modulation of neural responses. This is super cool. So she used neural responses to 1,000 sentences to train an encoding model. And this result nicely replicates the findings I showed you from Martin Schrimpf. This is here just using one particular model that was a good performing model in the prior study. And then she extrapolated these predictions. So she searched a massive language corpus for strings that the encoding model predicts to elicit a really high response to in the language region. So we call these drive sentences. And here are some examples of what we find in the corpus that this model says these sentences should drive your language system strongly. And then she also looked for sentences that are predicted to elicit really low responses in the language system. So we call these suppressed sentences. And then in new participants, she collected data on both the original set and on these new drive and suppressed sentences. And indeed, you find that these sentences elicit the desired neural response. So you see much higher responses than the baseline for the drive sentences and much lower for the suppressed sentences. And this is the first demonstration of this closed loop stimulus design approach in a high level cognitive domain, building on similar work that's been done in vision. Right. We're also doing some work kind of stress testing the language models, but maybe in the interest of time, I'm gonna actually skip over this and we can talk about this in the language, in the question period if you'd like. So I've shown you that the language system is distinct from other cognitive systems. The language areas respond only when we produce and understand language, but are silent when we engage in diverse non-linguistic tasks. I've also told you that the language system supports both word retrieval and sentence structure building. And for the latter, we have evidence of both integratory and predictive computations. And although different regions of the language network appear to be functionally similar, the posterior temporal area appears to be most critical for language function. And finally, I've shown you that representations extracted from large language models are similar to those in the human language system, which makes them promising as candidate models of human language processing. So what would Liz think about these findings? Well, I think certainly she would have liked the integration of words and syntax and the distributed nature of language processing. And of course, she would have loved the work where neural networks are used as models of human language processing, as they're kind of the definition of emergentism. And I think she would be really thrilled by the incredible success of modern neural networks, aka large language models, to which some of the early Elman nets were an important precursor. So the only part that may seem at odds with how Liz thought about language is this first part on the specificity of the language brain areas. But I think this disconnect is only there on the surface. So first of all, functional specialization does not entail innateness. In fact, the way I talk about the language system as a store of form meaning mappings that can be used to both encode and decode linguistic messages should make it clear that I think the system emerges with experience. Indeed, the language network's response to language stimuli increases with age. So this is from a paper with Ola Zernov-Palchik and Amanda O'Brien about to be preprinted, showing increasing responses to language in kids across the age range from 4 to adulthood, the dark red bar. And of course, with for people with an innateness bias, they could say, well, this just reflects some kind of maturation of the language system, but we have other data that suggest otherwise. So here are responses to language in fully mature brains during non-native language processing, where languages vary in their proficiency levels. And we see a similar pattern recapitulated, which strongly suggests to me that the language system's response levels depend on the amount of experience with that language, such that with more experience, we're able to more fully engage our linguistic computations, which presumably leads to these stronger responses. And second, implementation in distinct brain areas does not imply distinct computations. Corey Shane and I wrote a position piece that made this point, although we came at it through a slightly different direction, where we argued that similarity of computations across domains, right, doesn't mean that those computations have to be supported by the same brain region. So for example, the fact that language relies on predictive processing, visual processing relies on predictive processing, music relies on predictive processing, doesn't mean that we have one region that supports prediction in a domain general fashion. In fact, it seems what we find is that predictive computations are implemented in each relevant set of areas, presumably because you need the knowledge of the relevant regularities in that domain to be able to generate predictions. So I think Liz would be okay with this one too. So before I stop, I wanted to point to a review I wrote with Anya Ivanova and Timur Regev that just came out that Ping mentioned, summarizing the work we've been pursuing over the last bunch of years, including some things I haven't talked about today. And another review is coming out shortly, an annual review is led by Greta Tuchkuta, which specifically focuses on the work I talked about in the third part, using large language models as models of language processing. And of course, I could not have done any of this without my incredible team. And I'm going to end on a slide that lists some of our ongoing directions in case you may have questions about those things that I didn't have a chance to touch on today. So thank you very much for listening.